My name is Mary. I am 60 years old. And there is one phone call that still echoes in my mind even after all these years. It was a cold autumn evening, the kind where the air feels heavy with silence. And I was preparing a simple dinner when the phone rang. I answered, expecting nothing unusual. But the voice on the other end was my son's, and it was trembling with panic. "Mom," he said, his words broken by fear. "It's impossible. She's here. She's on my flight. She's not at home." For a moment, my heart stopped. My son was a commercial airline pilot, and his life had always been measured by schedules, clear instructions, and unshakable routines. But that night, his voice carried something I had never heard before confusion mixed with dread. The she he spoke of was his wife, Emily. Just an hour before, I had spoken to her myself. She was supposed to be at home, safely preparing for the week ahead. And yet my son swore that she had just boarded his plane. Same face, same voice, same woman. Sitting quietly among the passengers, the human mind races to make sense of the impossible. Was it stress? Hallucination? Or something far darker, something that reaches beyond the limits of what we can explain? That call was the beginning of a story that changed my family forever. A story that has never been told outside these walls. Until now. When I first hung up the phone that night, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely set it back on the cradle. I remember standing in my kitchen, staring at the soft yellow glow of the lamp above the counter. The faint smell of simmering onions still hanging in the air. And realizing that the world as I knew it had just shifted into something I could not understand. My son was not the type to panic. From the time he was a little boy, he had always been steady, calm, almost unnervingly logical. Even as a pilot, it was that same steadiness that made people trust him. I gave his passengers the quiet confidence that they were safe. But that night I heard something crack inside him. His words were frantic, urgent, as though he himself didn't believe what he was saying. And yet he had said it with certainty. "She's here, Mom. She's sitting on my plane." I stood frozen for what felt like minutes. The silence of the house pressing in on me. Just an hour earlier, I had spoken to Emily. I had heard the familiar tone of her voice, the way she always asked about my health, the warmth in her laughter. She had been at home. There was no question in my mind. And yet, what my son was describing couldn't be denied either. He wasn't the kind of man to imagine things. If he said he saw her, then he truly believed it. My mind scrambled to find rational explanations. Could there be a woman on board who looked just like her? A double? A twin no one knew about? But none of it made sense. My son's voice was too shaken, too insistent. The rest of the evening blurred. I tried calling Emily, but there was no answer. I must have dialed a dozen times, my fingers trembling with each attempt, but the phone at her house rang into the void. Each unanswered call only deepened the unease in my chest. My son, meanwhile, was locked in his duty as a pilot. He couldn't simply abandon his responsibilities to chase after what he thought he had seen. His job was to land that plane safely, no matter the storm raging in his own mind. I tried to sleep that night, but sleep would not come. My mind replayed his words over and over, twisting them until they no longer made sense. I imagined her face among the passengers.com, almost unaware that her very presence was tearing reality apart. I imagined my son glancing back, his eyes catching hers, the shock flooding through him like a tidal wave. He had told me she hadn't spoken, hadn't even looked at him directly. She just sat there as though she were another stranger on the plane. But how could she be in two places at once? How could she be both at home and thousands of feet in the air? By the time dawn broke, I felt as though I had aged years in a single night. My son's plane had landed safely, and though he sounded exhausted when he called me, his words were still etched with fear. "Mom, it was her. I know what I saw. And when I walked through the cabin after landing, she wasn't there anymore." That detail chilled me more than anything else. If she had simply been a passenger, he would have seen her leave. Watched her gather her belongings, step onto the jet bridge with the others. But he hadn't. She had disappeared. I went to Emily's house that morning. I remember standing on her porch, knocking with a trembling fist, waiting for a door that felt like it would never open. And when it finally did, there she was, Millie, standing in her doorway, wearing the same housecoat she often wore in the mornings, her hair a little messy, her eyes tired but warm. She smiled faintly, surprised to see me so early. For a moment, the air left my lungs. She was here. She had always been here, and yet my son had seen her elsewhere. I couldn't tell her right then. How could I? How could I look into her face, so real, so familiar, and say that her husband swore he had seen her on his flight, that she had been sitting silently among strangers while also being at home? I mumbled something about wanting to check in on her, made small talk about groceries, the weather, anything to cover the storm raging in my heart. She invited me in, made tea, and sat across from me like nothing in the world was wrong. And all the while, I kept staring at her, wondering if I was losing my mind. But I wasn't alone in this. My son was shaken to his core. That evening, he came to my house, his face pale, his hands trembling in a way I had never seen. He described her seat in detail, row 17. All side, a pale blue sweater she often wore. Her hair tucked neatly behind her ears. He said she had looked exactly as she always did. Down to the way she adjusted her necklace, the one his father had given her years ago. He hadn't imagined it. He couldn't have. But the impossibility of it all left him broken. We tried to move on, to bury it under the weight of daily life. But it wouldn't let us go. The unanswered calls, the silence on that plane. The way she had vanished before his eyes, those things clung to us like shadows. And then, the following week, it happened again. Not on a plane this time, but in the airport itself. My son was walking through the terminal when he froze. There she was again, Emily, standing near a boarding gate, staring ahead as though waiting for a flight. She was wearing the same pale blue sweater. He rushed toward her, calling her name, but before he could reach her, the crowd shifted and she was gone. He searched the entire terminal, but she had vanished as quickly as she had appeared. When he told me this, I felt a coldness settle into my bones. This was no simple mistake, no trick of the eye. Something was happening. Something that bent the rules of the world we thought we knew. My son was unraveling, and I feared for him. Yet at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily herself was caught in something larger. Something beyond her control. Was it a haunting? A parallel world bleeding into ours? Or was it something more personal, something hidden within her that we had never understood? In the weeks that followed, the appearances became more frequent. Always in places connected to flight airports, planes, boarding gates, even a hotel lobby near one of his scheduled layovers. She would be there, silent, distant, unresponsive, never once acknowledging him. Always gone before he could truly reach her. And yet at the same time, she lived her ordinary life at home, caring for their house, speaking to me on the phone, showing up for family dinners. Two Emilys, one tethered to the ground, and another trapped in some strange liminal space of travel and vanishing. I began to watch her more closely. Not the one at airports, but the one at home. Did she know? Was she aware of these other appearances? Did she feel her life splitting in two? Sometimes when she sat quietly staring out the window, I wondered if she was elsewhere in those moments, her body here but her soul drifting through some unseen passage. Once I asked her casually, almost as though it were a joke, if she had ever experienced déjà vu, or felt like she was in two places at once. She laughed softly, but the look in her eyes flickered with something deeper, something unspoken. That was when I began to keep a journal. Each time my son saw her double, I recorded the date, the time, the location. Each time I spoke to her at home, I wrote down what she had been doing, how she had sounded, the clothes she wore. The patterns began to emerge, faint but undeniable. On the days when her double appeared, she often seemed tired, drained, almost as though part of her had been elsewhere. I didn't tell her about the journal. I didn't tell her about the sightings. Some secrets are too heavy to place on a person's shoulders, but the weight was crushing me. My son was unraveling, and I was caught between the two of them, the silent witness to a mystery that threatened to consume us all. Nights grew long, filled with whispers of the impossible. And every time the phone rang, I braced myself for his voice again, trembling with panic, telling me she was there when she shouldn't be. And deep inside, I began to wonder something I dared not say aloud. What if one of them wasn't her? What if one of the Emilys was not the woman we knew, but something else entirely, something wearing her face, barring her voice, living in her shadow? The thought that one of them might not be real haunted me in ways I can hardly put into words. I would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with Emily. Was it really her laughter echoing across the dinner table? Was it truly her voice that softened when she asked about my health? Or could it have been something else, a shadow wearing her skin, a presence that only pretended to belong? These questions devoured me, yet I kept them locked inside. Because to speak them aloud would be to invite a madness I wasn't sure I could escape. My son, meanwhile, grew more restless by the day. His eyes had changed, their calm precision replaced by something raw, frayed at the edges. Flying, once his sanctuary, had become a theater of dread. Every time he walked through an airport or boarded a plane, he braced himself, expecting her to appear again in that ghostly way. And more often than not, she did. One night, he came to me, his face pale, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold his glass of water. He told me he had seen her again, but this time was different. It was not just a fleeting glimpse across a terminal or a silent figure seated among passengers. No, this time she had looked directly at him. Their eyes had locked for a moment. And in that moment he swore he saw something impossible, a depth in her gaze that was both familiar and foreign, like staring into a reflection that did not belong to the person you loved. He said her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak. But before a word could escape, she vanished into the crowd. That detail shook me to my core, because it meant she wasn't merely a passive apparition. She was aware. After that encounter, he refused to keep it inside any longer. He told Emily. He sat across from her at their kitchen table, his voice trembling as he confessed every sighting, every impossible moment, every time he had seen her double. I wasn't there to witness it, but later he told me she had listened silently, her eyes filling with something unreadable, fear, sorrow, or perhaps recognition. When he finished, she didn't laugh or dismiss him. She didn't accuse him of stress or delusion. Instead, she whispered something that made his blood run cold. "I was afraid you'd notice." When he repeated those words to me, my world collapsed. For weeks, I had convinced myself that she couldn't possibly know, that this was something happening around her, to her, but not within her. But her confession revealed the truth. She was aware. She had always been aware, and she had chosen to keep it hidden. That night, he pressed her for answers, begged her to explain, but she broke down in tears. She told him she had felt it for years, a strange pull that sometimes tore her out of the present moment, depositing her in places she had no memory of reaching. She would come back exhausted, as though she had traveled across oceans in her sleep. At first, she thought it was just fainting spells or daydreams, moments of disassociation. But slowly, she realized they were more than that. Because sometimes people saw her. Strangers approached her in airports, asked if she was waiting for a flight, asked if she needed help. She would return home hours later, unable to explain where she had been. She told him she had hidden it out of fear that he would leave her, fear that he would think she was insane, feared that to speak it aloud would make it worse. The room spun when my son told me this. I remember sitting down heavily on the couch, clutching the armrest as though it were the only thing tethering me to the earth. The idea that she had lived with this secret, that she had endured it silently while presenting a mask of normalcy to the world, broke something inside me. But it also terrified me, because if she wasn't insane, if these experiences were real, then what did it mean? What was happening to her? And why did it keep pulling her toward planes, toward airports, toward the world of flight? We began to notice other patterns. She often woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her eyes wild with fear. Once, she whispered, I saw them again, but when pressed, she refused to say more. She became wary of mirrors, avoiding her own reflection, as though she feared she might see someone else staring back. And then there were the objects, small, mundane things that appeared in the house with no explanation. A boarding pass for a flight she had never taken. A hotel key card from a city she had never visited. Once, even a pair of sunglasses that didn't belong to anyone we knew. They would appear in her purse, in the pockets of her coats, on the nightstand beside her bed. Tangible proof that her other self had been somewhere real, somewhere physical. My son tried to ground her, to anchor her to the life they shared. He would hold her hand tightly in public, speak to her constantly during flights, anything to keep her present. But it was like trying to hold water in your fist. The more he tried, the more it slipped through. She began to fade before our eyes, her body thinner, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion. And yet, at the same time, her double seemed stronger, more present, more frequent. As though the balance was shifting, so the other Emily was gaining power while the one we knew was being consumed. I began to fear for my son's safety as much as hers. He was unraveling, barely sleeping, plagued by nightmares of losing her. He would call me at odd hours, his voice breaking, asking me what he should do, how he could save her. But I had no answers. How could a mother explain the unexplainable? How could I offer comfort when I myself lay awake each night? Haunted by visions of a woman who was both here and not here, alive and vanishing. And then came the night that changed everything. It was late winter, snow swirling outside my window, when the phone rang again. My son's voice was shaking, frantic, in a way that made my blood freeze. "Mom," he said, "she's here again, but this time she spoke to me." My heart slammed against my ribs. He told me he had been walking through the terminal after a long flight when he saw her double standing near a gate just as before. But when their eyes met, she didn't look away. She walked toward him, her steps deliberate, her gaze locked onto his. And then, in a voice that was both hers and not hers, she whispered, "I can't keep this up much longer." Before he could respond, she was gone. When he returned home that night, he was shattered. Emily herself was there, waiting in their house, unaware of what had transpired. He held her tightly, almost desperately, as though afraid she would slip away even while in his arms. And as he clung to her, she whispered the words that confirmed our deepest fears. "Sometimes, feel like I'm not the one who belongs here." The silence after those words was unbearable. It was as though a curtain had been lifted, revealing a truth too vast, too terrifying to face. My son tried to be strong, but I could see the cracks forming in him. He was a man who lived by certainty, by rules and systems that could be trusted. But now all of that had been shattered. The woman he loved was both with him and slipping away, tethered to two worlds, and none of us could stop it. In the weeks that followed, I began to feel a heaviness in the house itself, as though the walls had absorbed the weight of the secret we carried. Lights flickered at odd hours. The air grew cold in rooms where she slept. Once, I swear I saw her reflection in the hallway mirror, even though she was standing across the room. My breath caught in my throat and I turned away, refusing to look again. Because if I acknowledged it, if I admitted what I had seen, then I would have to accept that the Emily living in our home might not be the only Emily anymore. That, perhaps, in some way I couldn't comprehend. There were two of her fighting for the same existence. I could see my son drowning under the weight of it all. And I felt powerless to help. But deep inside, a darker question began to form, one that I dared not speak aloud. What if the double wasn't just a copy? What if it was the real Emily? The woman we held on to was only the shadow. The question of which one was real lingered over us like a storm cloud, dark and unrelenting. I tried to push it away, to convince myself that there could not be such a thing as two Emilys. But the more I resisted, the more undeniable it became. My son's encounters grew too frequent, too detailed, too impossible to dismiss. And the Emily at home began to unravel before my very eyes. She was no longer simply tired or distracted. There were moments when she seemed to fade entirely, her eyes distant, her body present, but her mind somewhere far away. She would stop mid-sentence, her gaze shifting upward as if she were hearing a sound no one else could. Sometimes she would whisper words under her breaths, fragments of sentences about gates, terminals, flights leaving at midnight. When I asked her about them, she would deny she had said anything at all. It was as though her life had become a tug-of-war between two worlds. And the rope was fraying. My son clung to her, desperate to save her, but his strength was failing. I saw him one evening, sitting alone in his car outside my house, his head bowed against the steering wheel, tears soaking into his uniform. He was a man who had guided hundreds of passengers through storms and turbulence, who had faced the weight of responsibility in the skies without faltering. But now he was broken, crushed under the mystery he could not control. And as his mother, I felt the unbearable ache of helplessness, watching your child suffer and knowing there is nothing you can do to take it away. Then came the night Emily disappeared. It was late spring, the air heavy with the scent of rain. My son called me at 2 a.m., his voice ragged with fear. "Mom, she's gone," he said. "She's not in the house." I woke up and she wasn't beside me. Her phone's still here, her shoes are here. She just vanished. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm, to think clearly. We searched the neighborhood, calling her name, our voices echoing in the empty streets. Hours passed and there was no sign of her. By dawn, we were ready to call the police. But then, just as suddenly as she had vanished, she was back. She walked through the front door as if nothing had happened. Her hair damp, her clothes disheveled, her eyes filled with a vacant sorrow. My son rushed to her, demanding to know where she had been, but she only whispered, "I don't know." I don't remember when I looked at her closely, though. I knew she was lying. She remembered, but the truth was too heavy for her to speak. After that night, she grew quieter, as though the fight had gone out of her. She no longer resisted the pull of the other world. Sometimes she would sit by the window for hours, staring into the distance, waiting for something only she could see. My son tried to bring her back with love, with patience, with fierce determination. But each attempt only seemed to push her further away, and I began to realize a truth that broke my heart. Perhaps she wasn't meant to stay. It was around this time that I began to notice a strange pattern in my son as well. He had always been so grounded, so steady, but now he too seemed to drift. I caught him staring off into space, his thoughts far away. Once he confessed that sometimes, while flying, he felt as though he were watching himself from outside his own body, as though he too were slipping into a parallel existence. My blood ran cold at his words, because I knew then that whatever was happening to Emily was spreading to him. The two of them were bound together. Ding! And the thread that tied them was unraveling. The final confrontation came on a night I will never forget. My son was scheduled for a late flight, and Emily insisted on accompanying him to the airport. It was unusual. She rarely went with him anymore, but something in her eyes told me this was different. I offered to drive them, and though they hesitated, they agreed. The car ride was silent, the air heavy with unspoken dread. Emily sat in the back seat, her gaze fixed out the window, her hands trembling in her lap. My son sat beside me, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped his bag. When we arrived at the terminal, I saw her double for the first time. She was standing by the gate, dressed in the same pale blue sweater, her posture calm, her eyes unblinking. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Two Emilys, one beside me, trembling with fear, and another standing in the terminal, waiting. My son froze, his face pale as ash. Emily saw her too, and for the first time, she did not look away. Instead, she whispered, "That's where I belong." Before we could stop her, she walked forward. The crowd parted around her as if she were invisible, and she approached her double with slow, deliberate steps. The other Emily raised her hand as though beckoning her closer. My son shouted her name, his voice breaking with desperation, but she didn't turn back. She reached her double, and for a brief, terrible moment, the two of them merged into one. The air seemed to ripple, the lights flickered, and I felt a pressure in my chest so heavy I thought my heart would stop. Then, in the blink of an eye, they were gone. Both of them dot the terminal erupted in confusion, people shouting, security rushing forward, but I barely heard any of it. My son collapsed beside me, his body racked with sobs, his cries echoing through the sterile walls of the airport. I held him, my own tears blinding me as the truth settled like ice in my bones. She was gone, both of her, and she was never coming back. In the days that followed, we clung to each other in our grief. The police conducted their searches, filed their reports, asked their endless questions, but none of it mattered. There was no evidence, no explanation, nothing that could make sense of what had happened. To the world, she had simply vanished without a trace. But we knew the truth. She hadn't disappeared, she had crossed over. To where we could not say years have passed since that night, but the memory remains as vivid as ever. My son still flies, though the light in his eyes has dimmed. He carries himself with quiet strength, but I know the weight he bears. Every time he steps into an airport, every time he walks through a terminal, he searches the crowd, hoping for a glimpse of her. And sometimes, though he rarely admits it, he swears he sees her. Just for a moment. Standing at a gate, waiting, watching. As for me, I have learned to live with the silence she left behind. I still hear her voice in my dreams, still see her smile in the quiet corners of memory. But I also carry the knowledge that there are mysteries in this world we will never unravel. Forces beyond our understanding that shape our lives in ways we cannot control. Some might call it madness. Others might call it fate. I only know it as loss. And yet, in my quietest moments, when the house is still and the night is heavy, I allow myself to wonder. What if she is not gone? What if she is still out there, walking through endless terminals, boarding flights that never land, caught between worlds? What if every time my son thinks he sees her, it is not his imagination but her way of reaching back to us? I will never know for certain. But I choose to believe that, somewhere, somehow, she still exists. Because the alternative, the thought that she has vanished into nothing, is too unbearable to hold. And so I carry her memory like a fragile flame, shielding it from the winds of doubt, keeping it alive in the darkness. My name is Mary. I am 60 years old. And this is the story of how one phone call changed everything, of how the impossible became real, and of how love endures even when the person you love slips beyond the world you know. It is not a story with answers. It is only a story with echoes. Echoes of footsteps in empty airports. Echoes of a voice that whispers in the dark. Echoes of a woman who is both here and gone, real and unreal, ours and not ours. And perhaps, somewhere, even now, she is boarding a flight.